Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. All right, so TK Coleman.
What's happening, brother?
So first, let me say that I'm really excited to have you on this podcast, in large part because this podcast would not exist without you. You were definitely one of the main people whose encouragement was a big part of me actually doing this. So, thank you, and I'm glad to have you here.
Oh man, well I'm honored to hear that, man, and all the credit be unto you for acting on your potential, taking a passion and translating it into action, and just allowing me to be a part of your journey is a really awesome thing. We all play a influential, inspirational role in each other's lives, but ultimately our lives are what we make of it through the decisions that we make. And you're responsible for those decisions. And so it's good to see you doing your thing, man, and good to see you putting philosophy out there and making it interesting and entertaining. So I hope this continues to grow.
Thanks, man. Now you are the main reason I wanted you on the podcast is that to me you are just somebody who I can have incredibly awesome philosophical conversations with. So that's the main credential that is relevant to me having you on the podcast. But you're also director of education at Praxis. Let me give you just a moment to say a bit about what that is.
Yeah, so Praxis is a career launch program, and our goal is to provide an alternative to the traditional credentialing system by providing young people with a cost-efficient and in terms of not only transaction costs, but opportunity costs, approach to developing the skills they need to develop to succeed in the real world, and to laying down a foundation upon which they can build a successful career. We don't believe that people have to wait 4 years before they can start creating value in the marketplace. We don't believe that people absolutely have to go to college in order to not just land a good job, but in order to build a successful career. We believe that the most important things are having the entrepreneurial mindset, knowing how to create value, and knowing how to build your own signal. And given the way in which, to use Mark Andreessen's language, software is eating the world, we believe that there's more opportunity to do that more now than ever before. And we're creating a way for people to not have to do that alone. We provide them with the community, with the curriculum, with coaching, and also with actual experience at a startup where they get to learn by doing. So that's what we do. If you want to learn more information about it, check us out at discoverpraxis.com. That's Praxis. Discover as in discover a new world. Discoverpraxis.com. If you want to email me directly, ask me any questions, email me at tk@discoverpraxis.com.
Cool, man. I'll put that information in the info for the podcast as well. I did this program, and it was absolutely fantastic. Got me my current job, which I absolutely love, and is also the first time I've had a job that I absolutely loved. Is also I think more than anything, what really impressed me about Praxis is just the quality of the people who do the program. Some of the most interesting, passionate, unique people that I've ever met. Yeah. All right, man. So I wanted to talk to you about Christianity.
I like it. Don't tread on anyone, sure. I like that.
Oh, yeah.
When you scratch, yeah.
So I wanted to talk to you about Christianity. The first conversation you and I ever had that was in a philosophical conversation was about the cosmological argument, if you remember. So it wasn't specifically about Christianity, but it was about theism. And then the last time I saw you a few months back, we had that discussion about religion and Christianity. And there was just a lot of fascinating stuff there. So I wanted to kind of, dig deeper into it.
Yeah.
My hope for this conversation it actually is to do something a bit more informal than some of the podcasts that I've done, to just sort of let the conversation go, and also maybe to make it a bit more personal than some of my episodes in the past have been. The first thing I want to ask you is, before getting even to the philosophy, like, what's your personal sort of story with Christianity? What is that? What is the role that Christianity has had in your life?
Sure. So I can't think back to a time in my life where I have not been significantly influenced by Christianity. My father is a pastor, and no, that doesn't lend any automatic integrity to my life. No, it does not get me into heaven when I die, but it's an important starting point, because it captures the tradition within which I grew up, within which I was, within which my intellectual development took place. From day one, I was taught that questions concerning spirituality are literally a matter of life and death, not just in this life, but in the life to come, not just quantitatively in terms of years lived, but qualitatively in terms of this idea of the eternal life that Jesus referred to when he said, I've come that you may have life and life more abundantly. So I grew up in a traditionally religious family where we went to church not just every Sunday, but being a pastor's kid, we had church about 3 nights a week. We had Tuesday Bible class, we had Friday night services, and I didn't grow up in a family where the kids had the option of opting out. I was to discover very quickly that many of my friends grew up in those kinds of families, but I didn't have that option. I went to more church services in probably the first 10 years of my life than most people will go to for their entire lives if they go every Sunday and never miss a service. Because we not only had those 3 services a week, but we also had, my dad's church was part of a fellowship of churches. And so there were often other church events, and we would have services that we would go there. So it wasn't uncommon for us to be in church services, my brothers and I, 4 to 5 nights a week. And we went to a Pentecostal church. So it was very charismatic, not as dramatic as the Blues Brothers, perhaps, but not too far from that. And so church services were long. It wasn't like we went to Sunday Mass and got out of there in an hour. We would leave home, no later than like 8 in the morning, and usually get back like 7, 8 in the evening. It was a full day of church, and those services were long, man. And I grew up in a family that didn't just preach attending church services. It wasn't a clock in, clock out family. My mom knew her Bible. My dad knew his Bible. We read the Bible together as a family every single night. We prayed together every single night. I even remember, in addition to doing all of that, hearing the sound of my mother's voice making her way around the home as she would anoint the walls with blessed oil, or, laying her hands on our foreheads and praying over us as she moved about the house. We were taught to have a spiritual worldview in every area of life. Christianity for us wasn't just a moral thing. It wasn't just a matter of, here are the rules of conduct that you are to abide by. Don't do these sins and do these good deeds. But we also were taught things like, there are real existing spiritual entities and spiritual forces in our world. There literally are angels. There literally are demons. And everything that you observe and experience in the material world is the outcome of battles and events that are taking place behind the scenes. Like when you read the book of Job and you see the conversation between God and the devil, and Job goes through all of these trials and tribulations, that was the outcome of a cosmic behind the scenes conversation. We were taught that these kinds of conversations and events were real. So spirituality played a big role, and I never knew what it meant to have a casual attitude towards it. We were taught that the afterlife was real. We were taught that heaven and hell were real. We were taught that where you stand on the existence of God, on the deity of Jesus, that these were matters of great import, that these were matters of life and death.
How did you, as a kid, how did you feel about it? Was it something that was it something that like, were you sort of scared about how important it was and whether you were going to live up to it? Were you just sort of, yeah.
So here's where I disappoint everyone who grew up in a religious home and would just love for me to bash it and say things that reinforces, the bitterness and resentment they have towards their religious upbringing. But I didn't experience any of that as traumatic at all. And I don't feel the need to say that in order to protect anyone. It was the norm. It was the way life was presented to me. It seemed quite reasonable. And it is the belief system that my parents sincerely abided by and continue to abide by.
So like, let me ask you this, like as a kid, let's say you guys are going to one of these church events that's like the whole day. How'd you feel about it? I mean, were you sort of looking forward to it? Were you kind of like, yeah, I get that this is important, but like I want to play. Like, what was your kind of attitude about it?
Oh, sure. So there's a very good analogy between this and school. So there are two dimensions to this. One is, how did I feel about the ideas and the experiences? And how did I feel about not, involuntarily participating in the institutional life, of my faith? When it comes to the ideas, I was all in. I've always loved to read, and although it made my parents concerned at various stages, I was always drawn to like the darker, more science fiction friendly elements of Christianity. So I would love books on like spiritual warfare, books on like angelology and demonology. I would love books on like end time prophecy. So, I mean, when I was a kid, I would read like the prophecies in the book of Daniel, the prophecies in the book of Revelations. And I was really into Mark of the Beast type stuff. And I would watch, on the Christian networks, all of the guys that talked about end time prophecies and decoding the mysteries of the Bible. I loved that kind of stuff. And I loved the experience, whatever that meant to me as a child. I loved the experience of Christian community. I loved the experience of the meaning that faith gave to my life. From my earliest days as a child, I had a deep sense that I was created for a reason. And that reason is not something that imposes upon me. That reason is something that gives me the right and the responsibility and the power to express my creative potential. That's always been an exciting idea. However, just like school, I was always a lover of ideas. I loved learning. I loved reading. But boy, did I hate having to go to class, right? That was boring. And I would say that my experience of going to church services as a kid, 90% of the time, boy, was that a snoozer. I've never been a fan of church music all that much. Even growing up, my older brother would bring in a lot of the contemporary Christian music, which was very different from like traditional choir music or praise and worship music. So I grew up listening to like stuff that was the older saints kind of considered it more like worldly type Christian music. I listened to Commission or the Winans and stuff like that, a lot of the contemporary stuff. And I enjoyed that stuff, but I never really liked church music that much. My dad would capture my attention. There were a few preachers that, for whatever reason, they had something going on that made me sit up and listen. But for the most part, when I was at church, I was either playing with my friends or falling asleep or just being somewhere in fantasy land. And surprisingly enough, faith was most interesting to me on my own time when I'd be digging through my parents' libraries trying to figure out the mysteries of end time prophecy or asking my mother a ton of questions about, what this multi-headed dragon in the book of Revelation really symbolizes, that's when faith got exciting to me, thinking about those kinds of things or talking with other Christians and stuff. So one favorite childhood memory of mine is my dad would often pick up other pastors or guest preachers from the airport. And my childhood is filled with memories of being in the car with my dad and there being some other pastor there. And when you're a kid, everybody who's not your parent is automatically like 10 times more cool and interesting. And you're way more receptive to them because it's not their job to teach you. Your parents, it's their job. So it's what they get paid to say. So you dismiss it. And I would be in the car with my dad and these other preachers, and I would just be asking them questions about the meaning of the Bible, questions about the challenges of life, questions about their views on what the afterlife might be like. And I remember these guys just being some of the coolest, most interesting, open-minded people, never felt threatened by my questions. And that was a really fun time. So, yes, church services were boring. but the overall experience of growing up in a Christian home was quite awesome for me, quite interesting for me, and certainly not without its challenges as well. But I'll wait for you to ask me questions about that so that I don't take the risk of just blabbing. One last thing I'll say, though, about my upbringing, since we're doing a little philosophy. When I first encountered philosophy, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, there was a natural sense of getting how much it mattered. I never went through that period that some people go through when they encounter philosophy, which is that period of asking, why does this matter? Why are we even asking these questions? Like, who cares? For me, every philosophical question, like, what is the number 2? Like, seriously, what is the concept of two-ness, right? Do numbers exist in some sort of Platonic space? Are abstract entities real independently of the mind, or are these just mental constructs? And what's the difference between those two? What are the implications? Is there a God? Is there an object of moral law by which our behavior can be measured independently of like culturally relative standards? These questions were ones that I had always been taught were the ones that you got to have an answer to. And the only difference between philosophy and religion was that religion gave you the answers based on the authority of a particular text and a tradition, while philosophy said, well, everything's up for questioning. And so we're going to start with the questions that religion answers and take a look at all the different answers that are being presented and ask each of those answers and answerers, what are the reasons that can be set forth for them? So philosophy was immediately recognized by me as important because my Christian upbringing kind of prepared me to say, oh yeah, this stuff is seriously, because if there is a God, it's the most important truth for us to know. And if there isn't, it's really important for us to stop wasting our time with such an influential idea, that kind of thing. Am I answering the question?
Yeah. Actually, I had something of a similar experience. And I mean, to this day, I think that it seems obvious to me that my interest in philosophy comes from the same impulse that as a child made me a very religious child. It's basically the same kind of impulse. It's the sense of the importance of figuring out, like why and what to do with like the experience of being alive. And if there are things like, God, or if there's a certain religion that's true, or even really abstract facts about like, about the ontology of numbers or things like that. These are things that are going to have significance for these like very important and fundamental things. And I don't think I've ever shed that. If anything, I think it took doing a lot of philosophy to first start considering the idea that philosophy might not be that important. It took like doing a lot of philosophy to start thinking of that idea and taking it seriously. And eventually realized like, maybe, but it's just clearly not the case for me, right?
I've eased up a lot on my initial stance regarding the importance of philosophy. When I first discovered it, I would get so upset by anyone who didn't see philosophy as important. And I felt such a great need to popularize it and promote it. And it reminds me of a time where I got angry with the professor. I asked the philosophy professor, hoping he'd give me some answers that I could use to shut down the naysayers. I said, why is philosophy important? And he said, who cares? It's fun. And I was so disappointed with that answer. But now I think the same way. Yes, I believe that philosophy is important. But if you don't, happy life, happy life, man. I think it's fun, and I can't not do philosophy. It's too much a part of my nature. So the only question for me is, can I do it well? That's the only question. Other than that, it's something that I must do. Even if I be criticized for doing it poorly, I absolutely must do it,
Yeah, I think I more or less feel the same way at this point. I'm not necessarily convinced it has a great deal of general importance, but personally, I've given up on. I think I went through a phase of wanting to sort of say like, I've kind of realized philosophically that philosophy is not that important, so let me kind of let it go, and just actually realized that I actually cannot. So here I am.
So I believe that philosophy is important. But I've managed to liberate myself from any emotional attachment to convincing other people that it is. And that it sounds like we differ there. It sounds like you're not so sure it's important.
See, for me, this is part of what I meant earlier when I said that it comes from the same kind of impulse that my like religiosity as a kid came from. I think that what is important is to have some kind of sense for people of. Sometimes I use the word spirituality, but I'm using it in a very narrow sense, which really just means like a seeking a purpose to one's own life. That's kind of really what I see as spirituality as being. And so it seems to me like it is important for people to have something like that. Sure. And to me, it comes very naturally for that to come to be expressed through philosophy, through trying to understand the world through the philosophical sort of language game. But, I kind of think for other people, that impulse may be expressed in entirely different ways. Sure. And I don't think I have a good reason for wanting to privilege philosophy. Not only in terms of sort of recommending that people do it, but even in any sort of like fundamental importance.
Yeah. Some of it too is a matter of semantics. I kind of think about what it's like for me to listen to people harp on about work, right? Where people might argue against work, or people might say that work is a bad thing, or I don't want to have to work. And whenever I listen to those people talk, I think to myself, oh, absolutely. If I defined work in the way you're talking about it, I would also agree that the abolishment of it, or the abandonment of it, or the abhorrence of it is the necessary logical conclusion. But I look at what you're doing as you're arguing about work as a kind of work. I look at work as the creative expression of one's interest. I look at work as the expenditure or investment of energy towards the accomplishment of a goal. So if you're writing a book about how much work sucks, that's part of my concept of what it means to work, right? So when I hear someone say, I don't like work, or I don't want to have to work, what I hear them saying is something along the lines of, I don't want to have to depend on a particular job that I don't like out of financial necessity, but I want to spend my creative energy on projects that I deeply believe in. And that to me is what I mean by work. Yeah, I don't see a need to be the language police and arrest people for using words in a different way. I don't think there's a right and wrong way to use the language, but it's important to understand that kind of semantic variance, that it exists when we're talking about these kinds of topics. And so in a similar way, when it comes to philosophy, yeah, certainly there's a way we could use the word philosophy that makes it the sort of thing that probably isn't all that important. Certainly we can say that there are some conversations that academicians are having about matters of philosophy that don't seem to be all that relevant to things that most human beings care about. But there's a broader understanding as well, a more fundamental understanding that we're all participating in it all the time, whether we acknowledge it as important or not, whether we recognize that's what we're doing or not. And a rose by any other name is a rose just the same. And what matters to me is not what we call it or not how important we think it is. What matters to me is that we do it well, right? Philosophy is kind of like love. Everybody's doing it. Even if they call it something else. And I just care about the doing it part, that you do it and that you do it well.
And what is it that you think that you're sort of giving the name philosophy that everybody's doing?
Philosophy to me is the process of attributing answers to the fundamental questions of life, questions about meaning, our role in the cosmos, questions about morality, questions about the good life, questions about the nature of things, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, those kinds of questions. Attributing answers to those questions and proceeding to judge others and create experiences on the basis of those answers. I see that as the dynamic process of philosophy. And so I see everyone as having a philosophy and everyone as being involved in the process of philosophizing, even if they do it poorly and even if they do it selectively. We all have moments where our philosophical side gets exposed. Moments when we get angry about people who have certain beliefs, and then we proceed to interrogate them. We proceed to challenge them. So you may have a person who walks around not thinking of themselves as philosophical, but when they run into that Christian guy with the sign that says gays are going to hell, now it's time for that philosopher inside of you to get exposed, because you get mad at that guy and you start arguing with him and you start saying things like, well, how can you possibly say that someone is wrong for their sexuality? Welcome to ethics. That's what you're doing. You're asking philosophical questions about ethics. You are setting forth arguments for your ethical philosophy, and you are challenging another person's presuppositions. You don't do it often. I probably couldn't make you do it when you don't want to. You haven't taken a class on it, but you have answers to the questions. You ask the questions. You care about these things very deeply. And when the right buttons are pushed, you will confront other people about what they believe and try to engage them in dialogue. So we're all philosophers, we just don't all do it well, and we just don't all do it all the time or in the same context.
Or consciously.
Or consciously. Yeah.
Which I think is yeah. So I think I agree with what you're saying. And I think an important aspect of it is that consciousness part of it, because I think I probably would agree with the idea that if you don't think you have a particular philosophy, or that you don't care about philosophy, then most likely you have unconsciously adopted philosophies and haven't really examined them very thoroughly, and are in large part under their influence without having sort of examined them in that way.
And well, maybe we can take it even a step further, and we can say two more things. We can say, if you think you don't care about philosophy, that probably means something more like you have a set of activities, probably very academic and alienated, that you associate with the word, and what you really mean is you don't like that. Okay. And the second thing is, you probably do occasionally have really philosophical conversations, but you just don't call it that. You don't recognize it as that. I mean, there are times where guys get together and they have conversations about what women really want, right? And they'll go for hours debating, philosophies about that kind of stuff, and debating, pickup artistry, debating game, debating social dynamics, going back and forth. They don't think of themselves as doing philosophy. They think of themselves as doing guy talk, but they're doing a lot of philosophy. Again, doesn't mean they're doing it well, but they're doing that. And I think all human beings have conversations like that, but just in different contexts about different things.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Hey, let me pull you back to Christianity for a moment.
Yeah.
At what point in your life, if any, did doubt enter in any serious way about Christianity?
Doubt is a multi-dimensional thing. Doubt is kind of like faith. It's not something that you're in or out of. It's a path that you are always on, and it manifests in your life to varying degrees, right? Because even within the context of belief, I believe in the existence of God, and I believe God loves me, there's plenty of room for doubt. Doubt is not the unique phenomenon of the agnostic or the atheist. In fact, when you read the stories of the Bible, there are all sorts of moments of doubt. When God summons the prophet Jeremiah, Jeremiah expresses to God. He's literally talking to God. So there's no questions about God's existence, but he expresses doubt about him being too young. God says to him, Jeremiah, I knew you while you were being formed in the womb. He expresses doubt about his ability to speak, about his ability to do the job that he's called to do. God has to give him comfort, knowing that, to let him know that, hey, I will be with you. I will see you through this. So I've always experienced doubt, as I believe any honest believer would tell you, but not necessarily doubts about the existence of God. So the first form of doubt I experienced was about things like my ability to live a life that was pleasing to God, or doubts about the degree to which it is really true that God will protect me from harm, right? When you're very young, you kind of feel quite safe with the idea of God, because you believe that God looks out for you and the world is good. But then you start to notice evil. You start to see that a good Christian person who from all appearances seem to be living a good life can have harmful things happen to them. And then you begin to wonder, well, shucks, I know that God loves me, but clearly God doesn't intervene sometimes to stop evil. So to what degree can I rely on God's protection? Is it all about the afterlife now, or does it have relevance in this life? And you have those kinds of doubts, like to what degree can I count on my faith to provide any alleviation of my existential angst? That's the first kind of doubt. But I imagine you're asking me about this sort of epistemological doubt, doubt about the truth of the Bible, doubt about the existence of God. That sort of doubt came freshman year of college, because I grew up in a pretty sheltered environment, and I didn't have that much interaction with non-Christians. Occasionally, some guy that worked with my dad, but never much opportunity to interact with non-Christians. But when I went to college, my first year, and I was a theater major at that, and I was around so much cultural diversity, religious diversity, sexual diversity, unlike anything I had ever seen. And many of these people that I was around were some of the loveliest, kindest, warmest, interesting, funniest, humane people that I knew. A person that's a Buddhist over here, a person that's an atheist over there, a person that's gay over there, a person that's lesbian over there. All the kinds of people that I had no real conceptual apparatus for explaining, apart from they're filled with demons or deceived by the devil, right? And those initial doubts begin to creep in, like these people seem to be better human beings than me in many ways, and they don't have the right beliefs. What's up with that? Okay, but that wasn't an assault on my belief system, but it was kind of a tension that it took me a while to become conscious of. The next stage came when I was involved with different Christian groups like Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and one of the things that we would do at this time was we would go about on campus sharing what we call tracts. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those, where they're little pamphlets that kind of give a quick take on the gospel, and usually at the ends of them, there's like an invitation to say the sinner's prayer and accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, that kind of thing. And when we would do that, many of the people that we'd approach and talk to about the faith, they would ask these really tough questions, or they would make these objections. Well, that's just your belief, man. Or how do you even know that that's true, man? Like, we can't go back in history. How do you know that happened? Blah, 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 blah. And I wasn't the one leading these sessions, so I would watch the Christian person go back and forth. And I'm not trying to make a knock against Christians in general, but when it came to the people that I was watching have these conversations, man, they were losing. They were not doing well, okay? And I didn't know how to intervene to help them, because I'm hearing these questions for the first time, and I'm thinking, oh, that's a good question. And then I look to the Christian for the answer. It's like, oh, I don't think you answered the question. And after a while, it kind of became this thing where I'm like, the conversation would happen. I'm listening to the atheist, listening to the Christian, go back and forth. And then I'm sort of like, hey, hold up, man. Hey, dude, hold up. Like, let me talk to you for a minute. Like, so what did you mean by this? And those questions eventually became my own. I began to internalize those questions, and I began to feel a sense of responsibility towards them. Sort of at the time, my beliefs didn't change, but I began to feel like this isn't right. It's not right to be unable to answer these questions. That just feels wrong. You certainly don't have the right to be preaching to people and telling them what they ought to believe if you can't interpret their questions charitably and answer them compellingly. It is not enough to just be like, oh, you don't want the truth, and get mad when someone objects, especially if that person's being cool and classy. And so I internalized that and wrestled with that for a while, and then entered Christian apologetics. One summer at home in Chicago, I was in my brother's room. My brother was in Bible school at this time, my older brother. And I was in his room fishing around for some reading material, and I stumbled across some articles, because he would always have good books. At that time, I didn't have money to buy books. I always go read his books. and I saw like a stack of articles called Just Thinking. And it was from Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. And I started to read these Ravi Zacharias articles, and I didn't know that it was called Christian apologetics at the time, but he was addressing these kinds of questions. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is some really good stuff. And I just like stayed up and I just like read about 50 of those articles. He had a big stack of them. And when I found out that was called philosophy, I said, this is what I got to be doing right here. This is what I got to be doing. And so when I went back to school, I went to the philosophy department. I talked to the chairperson of the department, and I said, I want to major in philosophy. And he said, okay, have you taken any classes in philosophy? I said, no. He said, have you read any books on philosophy? I said, no, but I know this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I know this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And he was like, okay, well, usually before someone declares a major, what they do is they take a class in it to sort of see how they like it. And I said, nope, I know this is what I want to do. I don't need to take a class. This is what I want to major. I said, I read all the Ravi Zacharias articles. I'm ready. This is what I want to do. and they couldn't talk me out of majoring in philosophy. And so I immersed myself in the philosophy department, and I found myself in an environment where all of these professors reacted and responded to my questions in a way that was different than the Christians I went to first. And hey, sorry Christians, I got to keep it real when it comes to my biography. I do understand that there could have been some Christians that I could have run into in some other possible world who wouldn't have been threatened by my questions. But that simply was not the case in my personal history as my story played out. You know, the Christians that I went to were kind of threatened by it. Be careful with that. They were as terrible at answering the questions as the ones that were being challenged by the atheists. But the philosophy professors, they were delighted by my questions. They were not threatened by them. And they weren't all a bunch of atheists. There were atheists and there were Christians among them. You even met one of them who did a group discussion for Praxis, Dr. Tim McGrew. I felt at home. I didn't have answers, and I was very far away from that, but I felt at home because I was amongst people who were comfortable with questions and felt like asking questions was a good thing. And so there in the midst of my doubt, I felt closer to God than I had ever been because I had moved away from a concept of God that was insufficient for helping me navigate the complexities of life. And although my concept of God at this stage was fragile, it was more meaningful to me because it was nuanced and it was unthreatened by my uncertainty. And for me, that's when both doubt became real and in a paradoxical way, faith did as well.
And would you say that that attitude is still there with you? That to some extent doubt is a part of being a Christian for you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wouldn't even know what it would mean to be a person of faith without being someone who wrestles with doubt, you know. And that doesn't mean that faith is some anti-intellectual thing where the purpose of faith is to blindly believe in something for which there is no evidence, so that you don't have to deal with your doubts. No, it's recognizing that in any context where faith is required, there is still room for doubt. So let's take human relationships, right? If you're married or if you have a business partnership, you are placing faith in that other party. And this faith isn't a blind faith. It's based on a number of different things you have come to know about that person, a number of different things you have discovered through inquiry and through investigation. You didn't just choose to marry someone randomly off the street. You didn't choose to start a business with just the first person that you saw. You did a lot of critical thinking about the process. And yet, over the course of time, as you go through things with that person, you have moments that make you doubt many things. Am I capable of meeting the needs of this person? Am I capable of getting through this moment? Am I capable of finding out what we need? Am I capable of living up to this task? Do they really love me? Do they really care? Like, you have all sorts of things that go on, and being in any healthy relationship means being honest with yourself about those questions and uncertainties and being willing to confront them with intellectual integrity.
When you and I spoke a couple of months ago, you talked about a sacramental approach to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain what that is and how you came to that?
Yes. So paradoxically, I owe this understanding to Marcus Borg, the late Marcus Borg now. And I say paradoxically just because once upon a time, I saw Marcus Borg enemy. Marcus Borg was part of the Jesus Seminar, a group of scholars who were very big about making a distinction between the Christ of history and the Christ of faith. Were often looked upon, and still probably are, by many Christian apologists as sort of heretics, because they were either skeptical at an agnostic level or just entirely disbelieved of certain biblical claims about things like the physical resurrection of Jesus or just the historical reality of Jesus. And so I initially read Marcus Borg in an effort to refute him, and in an effort to focus on what he had to say about things like the historicity of the New Testament. But there was something about Borg's approach to spirituality that surprisingly captured my interest. And it was this understanding of Christianity being a sacramental religion. So Borg's meta theory of religion is that religion is sacramental, and a sacrament is anything that mediates the reality of the sacred. Or you could say a sacrament is anything that imparts spiritual power, spiritual strength, spiritual energy. Or you could say that a sacrament is something that has qualities about it that facilitate experiences of inner transformation. Okay, so the difference between a sacrament and a belief would be that a belief is about what you give intellectual assent to. A sacrament is about participating in something that, pardon the heretical language, has kind of an alchemical effect upon you, right? And this effect is bigger than and sometimes independent of the intellectual understanding you have of what's going on. So I'll give a non-religious example of the kind of experience that could be, with some stretching, an analogy for something that's sacramental. Let's say a near-death experience. And I don't mean the mystical kind. I mean like the kind where you stare possible tragedy or possible death in the face. Not I saw a light at the end of the tunnel, but maybe somebody put a gun to your head and you genuinely thought you were going to die. Or somebody shot at you and like the bullet missed, or someone like confronted you and tried to rob you, whatever, and like you thought, I'm looking at the last 5 minutes of my life right here. And somehow, some way, you get out of that situation and you get like another shot at life, and you're just never the same again, right? Like you don't know why. You can force yourself to think about it and come up with a retroactive philosophical explanation, but there's something about that raw, visceral experience that you participated in that creates a shift in your mindset, in your priorities, and in how you're going to orient your life from that point forward. I'll give another example of something that could be sacramental. Something I know Christian probably would want to hear, but take psychedelic experiences. Most people who take psychedelics rate it in as one of the top 5 experiences of their lifetime. And if you read a book like the DMT Molecule, for instance, or the Psychedelic Gospels, for instance, these books will talk about how there are people who, on experiences of psilocybin or ayahuasca or iboga, they've had these profound, visual experiences or syntactical experiences that resulted in addictions being cured, or resulted in phobias just dissolving, or they had these experiences of boundary dissolution that resulted in them just feeling more empathetic. And they don't entirely understand why, but they know that they participated in something and it's not the same. And these experiences are very different from making a willpower-based commitment to try harder at being a morally good person, right? There's something that's deeper there. That's kind of what a sacramental experience is like. So the idea behind a sacramental approach to Christianity is when you approach the scriptures, or when you approach the narratives, the parables, the songs, the traditions, things like prayer, the most important question is not, do I believe this really happened? When I read the book of Numbers and some event is described, do I really believe that happened? Like, can I meet the belief requirement? And this is kind of like the dominant approach to religion today, right? In order to be a true believer, there's a belief requirement you have to meet. You have to accept as true a set of propositions. And if you doubt those propositions, you don't get to be sure that you are a believer. And the community will either be hostile to you or be patient with you, with the implication of that patience being, we'll tolerate it for a little while, but we need to pull you along in order to make sure that you're actually a believer here. You know, I've been there before, but we got to get you over these doubts, because until you can say the creeds with intellectual honesty, your belief status is kind of like, it's sort of in limbo. Like there may be like a grace period God gives you for having questions like that, but you know, we got to get you through that. Whereas the sacramental approach says the most important question is not, do I believe this really happened at an intellectual level, but rather, how is the reality of the sacred being mediated to me through this experience? How am I being transformed by my engagement with this story? That when I listen to the parables of Jesus and I listen to them meditatively, you know, it's not, well, is this literal? Is it like, did Cain really kill Abel? Did the blood of Cain, like, is it metaphorical when God says the blood of your brother Cain cries out to me from the ground? Or has quantum mechanics come along with an explanation that shows how the chemical constituents of his blood literally transmitted information to the divine mind? The sacramental approach says, hey, all of that's possible. We can be agnostic about that. We can engage in debates about that. But the important question is, in what way does my soul speak to me as I engage that story? You know, how is God engaging me through that?
The connection that you made to psychedelics seems really appropriate. So I've done psychedelics, and I definitely have that relationship with them. You know, I would rank doing psychedelics among the top 5 most important experiences of my life.
Cool.
And definitely my experience has been that doing psychedelics gives me a kind of experience that, as you said, is transformative, changes my mindset, the way that I want to be, the way that I seem to relate to the world. And it seems to suggest facts about reality, right, that I don't fully understand but aren't quite what I'm assuming. Let me put it that way, right? But it's very difficult, even being as sort of philosophically minded as I am, to take from that a proposition that I could give you about the nature of reality, that I could be like, hey, this proposition, I now know that it's true because I did psychedelics. Very, very difficult to, and I try, because I have such a philosophical mindset that I can't help but relate to psychedelics in that way. So I constantly try, and I have a lot of fun doing so, but I find it always elusive. But also very much like, even though that aspect of it is very fun, at the end of the day is actually really not the point. The point is not actually to get a true proposition about the nature of reality, but to experience something. Okay.
Yes, and what's awesome about that is, first of all, it's totally fine to try to see if you can extract some true propositions from the psychedelic experience. And it's quite possible that others have done it and succeeded, and you should take a look at their arguments. And it's quite possible that you may find that you're able to ground some philosophical claims that, come from those experiences. That's all possible, at least. Possible in the sense of logically possible to assert that it is so, conceivable. But you don't need to have settled any of that in order to be able to say, ever since I had that psilocybin experience, I haven't been afraid of cats anymore.
Right.
or I haven't had the urge to smoke anymore, or I've just been so much more respectful and considerate towards others now. So so you've separated those two things, and it gives you the freedom to be playful and passionate in your pursuit of answers, while not turning them into a prerequisite for the transformative experience. Now bring that back over to Christianity. One of the problems of a religious approach to meeting the belief requirement is that there are people in every religious community who are sincere doubters, right? I have participated in a number of youth groups where young Christians have suffered from anxiety because they want to believe. Like, I mean, I want to believe, yeah, I'm a Christian. Like, I'm committed to going to church. I'm committed to doing all of this. I don't have any like sins that I'm trying to justify. Like, this is where I want to be. But I mean, yeah, I mean, like, I've got some questions too. Like, I don't know. I don't know if that really happened. I don't know if that story is really true, right? And, you know, look around and they're scared. And if you accept the meet the belief requirement notion, then that means you've got to get that person to take a deep dive into apologetics in order for what their faith to be real. You know, different Christians may have different views about how much grace God gives that person, but at the end of the day, what is our duty to them? But we got to answer their questions. You know, send them to the deacon that knows apologetics, get them a bunch of apologetic books, send them to the links to William Lane Craig videos, or try to talk to them and whatever, or pray for them, hope God deals with it, whatever. And it sort of creates what I take to be an unhealthy relationship with one's doubts. And when you look at the way Jesus dealt with non-believers, like when Jesus says that, you know, in the end times, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, you know, have we not cast out demons in your name? You know, have we not, you know, healed the sick and done all of these great deeds? He's specifically talking about people that meet the belief requirement. They're saying, Lord, Lord. So they're not saying, hey, dude, they're identifying you, Lord and Savior. They perform miracles. They do supernatural feats. And he says, depart from me, I never knew you, right? He doesn't say, depart from me, you didn't know about me. Depart from me, I never knew you. Depart from me because we had no intimate connection. We had nothing going on with each other that was grounded in the realm of visceral experience. All you had was a belief system, you know? And he explicitly condemns that. All you had was a belief system and a lifestyle where you perform supernatural miracles. But those will be the people that will be the Christian heroes today. I mean, they weren't just saying the right things. They were doing things that Christians aren't doing today. They were casting out devils. Most Christians don't claim to do that. Most Christians don't even pretend to believe that that's possible. You know, they were healing the sick. Most Christians don't claim to do that. Most Christians are busy trying to come up with arguments for why that doesn't happen anymore. These guys were doing that. And he said, depart from me. You never knew me. Now, of course, you can object to that and say, yeah, but that doesn't mean that belief is an unnecessary condition. It just means belief isn't a sufficient condition. Okay, fair enough. But we still come back to this problem of now being forced to dismiss the person that has these sincere doubts as someone that's either not being fully honest, you know, or if they end there, then they weren't truly making themselves available to all God's guidance. You know, they weren't disciplined enough with how much they devoted themselves to praying about it or the apologetic books and so forth. And the sacramental approach offers people a way to thrust themselves, immerse themselves into their faith and find deep meaning in their spiritual tradition, and make themselves available to the transformative power of spiritual disciplines without having all of their questions answered. And what's paradoxical about that is that you can often get answers to those questions in that way. It's kind of like what we talk about in Praxis, kind of this entrepreneurial approach to life. You have a creative idea. Before you start the podcast, well, I kind of got this podcast idea, but I don't know if it'll work. I don't know if it'll be any good. I kind of want to call it this, but I don't know if I should call it that. Well, I want to talk about philosophy, but what if I do the podcast for 3 years and then I'm kind of interested in anthropology and then sports and I don't want to do philosophy anymore? Like, anybody that's been through the creative process knows that all you're going to do is psych yourself out. The way you do it is by immersing yourself into the creative process before you have the answers. Buying into a way of seeing this thing that doesn't make it necessary for you to meet a belief requirement. Open yourself to possibility. Immerse yourself in the creative process. Don't chase belief, chase experience. And that experience will give you a wisdom, a kind of knowing that is of the sort that cannot be told to you, that you can't be argued into. Does that make sense?
It does. Now you've sort of distinguished the transformative experience of the sacrament and the relationship that you have to the sacred and to God, and then the sort of like literal belief in the claims. So at this point, there you are. You froze for a moment. At this point, where do you stand regarding the belief aspect? Like what are sort of the things that you do sort of literally believe in, as in like true propositions, which are the ones that you don't?
Yeah, man. So this is a dynamic process for me, and I imagine with this being probably the first time I've spoken about this, at least these questions in any public way, at least in a very long time, my answers must be terribly disappointing to anyone that might identify me as a Christian brother or anything like that. But there's an awful lot about which I'm quite agnostic, not stubbornly so, but I'm not sure where I stand on, do you think this really happened, for an awful lot of things in the faith of my upbringing. And it's not entirely clear to me what sorts of things were intended to be taken literally versus metaphorically. And this isn't something that I am as troubled about as I once was. An area where Borg has significantly influenced me is in my belief that you don't have to take the Bible literally in order to take it seriously, right? So, for instance, let's take a common Bible story where the literal interpretation is generally regarded as the right one. And let's talk about Jesus at the wedding of Cana turning water into wine. Okay, we're told they ran out of wine. Jesus had them bring water and transform that into wine. And it was said they usually bring out the best wine first, but you've saved the best for last. All right, now let's assume there's a literal interpretation to that. My question is, where does that get you? Like, seriously, don't be mad at me for asking it, but where does that get you? All right, it gets you to the level of saying, whoo, Jesus sure was impressive. All right, I mean, I'm not sure if you need that particular story. By the time you get, already got that belief in place probably, but all right. But what does that do for you? And your crappy relationships, your crappy job, your crappy life, the things that you struggle with. I would contend that even for the people that would lay down their lives for the literal interpretation, that the meaning they get from that story comes from imbuing it with a metaphorical element. And that metaphorical element for this particular story would go something like this. Jesus turning water into wine signifies God's divine ability to transform sorrow into joy, death into life, pain into relief, hopelessness into hope. That this story represents the possibility of the alchemical, the possibility of transformation, that nothing in human experience is set in stone, that there is always a higher possibility, that God is not bound by the laws of nature and by the fixed rules that seem to govern experience. And that brings great meaning to our lives when we are in a moment of hopelessness, it is the remembrance that just as Jesus turned water into wine, he can turn your sorrow into joy. He can take this situation that you're in that just looks absolutely terrible, and he can redeem it. It represents the possibility and power of redemption. Now, I would say, if you take away the literal, like if you're agnostic about the literal, you can still believe in that metaphorical. And you can still gain deep meaning from that. Okay? But if you take away the metaphorical and you keep the literal, I would contend that you don't really have anything except for yet another reason for what you already had, which is a reason for admiring God. You know, but you don't need that story to happen. If you believe in the existence of an all-powerful creator, you don't need a story about him turning water into wine at a wedding in order to know that that's something that he could do, in order to believe that that's possible. But that story is important to us because it is through the specificity of that story that some sacramental function is served, that our way of looking at the world is transformed in a certain way. Our hearts are comforted in a certain way. We are ministered to by that story in a certain way. Now, fortunately, you press me as an intellectually honest philosopher and say, hey, put it all on the table, man. Do you believe there was a real wedding there and that actually happened? Certainly in a metaphorical sense, I experienced that story as powerful. Right? Certainly when I set myself before that story, there's something powerful that happens. But I don't know. Still wrestling with a lot of those questions. You know, I'm still wrestling with them and sorting them out and engaging them in a way that, you know, most people who accept the literal would probably regard as a waste of time in their lives. That doesn't make me better than them. But it certainly doesn't make my faith less meaningful. Certainly not to me. But when you ask me as an intellectually honest person, can I say the creeds with honesty, with intellectual honesty? Well, in a certain sense, yeah. Just as I can with any prayer, because it's a sacramental experience for me. But parceling out how much of that is literally true, I just don't know. I don't know.
Now, so let me ask you this then. Given that you get what you get from the sacramental experience, and that is, you know, now you see this as like really the fundamental and kind of important aspect of being a Christian. Why does the question of whether this really happened or not remain something that you sort of struggle with? Because I, you know, in your situation, what I would want to say is, you know, if there isn't strong evidence for the idea that that really happened, then, you know, I mean, sure, it's possible that it happened, but you know, by default, we tend to disbelieve what we don't have strong evidence for, even if we wouldn't cross out the possibility. So, but you still seem more agnostic than willing to sort of say actual disbelief. What keeps you from going there?
Right. What keeps me from saying, you know what, I don't see this as even an important issue. I'm just going to go ride or die with the sacramental component. Well, a couple of reasons. First, I'm not sure if I use the word struggle. I prefer the word wrestle, just because struggle kind of has the connotation of like, this makes me anxious, you know, like it bothers me that I'm going through this for me. Whereas wrestle, you know, has the connotation of being persistent with my philosophy, right? I don't let go of the questions that have great import to me, even if I'm able to get a good night's sleep before, you know, without having answers. Two reasons. First of all, I'm not an agnostic on everything. I do have things that I believe, right? I do believe there's a God, okay? I do believe in Jesus. I do believe in the historical Jesus, okay? I don't believe that Jesus is a made-up story or the person of Jesus is a metaphor for something else. I believe that Jesus was a real person, right?
I haven't looked much into it, but from what I understand, there's pretty strong historical evidence that there was a historical Jesus. No?
Yeah. And I believe in the historicity of the New Testament, and I believe the Bible to be sacramental in a way that is distinct from, I believe, the story of Little Red Riding Hood or The Boy Who Cried Wolf is sacramental, right? When I speak of sacramental, I'm not just saying, hey, pick a book, any book, and open it up, and the story can speak to you in some way. Although I believe it is certainly possible to experience those things as sacramental, but I do believe the Bible to be a special book. I believe it to be a sacred book. I believe it to be a book of divine origin. And I believe those stories to be imbued with spiritual energy. So most of these questions have to do with questions about, as we delve into specific stories or specific doctrinal elements, where I stand on, the literal metaphorical interpretation, where I stand on what the author intended to be conveyed here, and so forth. And so I come at it as a believer on an intellectual level, in the underlying legitimacy and truth and sacredness of the book. And if you believe that about a book, I think you would care to understand it. I think you would care to form as many informed opinions about it as you can. And for me, that doesn't have to be done out of a fear that, I'm not going to be saved or that I'm going to go to hell if I don't get all the answers by the expiration date. It's driven by a passion for truth. It's driven by a desire to honestly engage and gather as much meaning from the text as I can. So think about it this way. Yes, it is true that there is an enrichment I can gain from the parables and so forth, even if I'm agnostic about the literal truth of that. But suppose it is literally true. If it is literally true, then I think my understanding and experience can only be aided, can only be enhanced by bringing my beliefs into conformity with that truth, right? And the mere possibility of that truth, coupled with the honest acknowledgement that there's a great deal of literature out there that I have not engaged, compels me. You know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah. So, first of all, I want to thank you for being the sort of person that I can ask these kinds of questions to, because I feel like it's not, it's not every day that you get to question somebody about their religious beliefs in a serious way. So I really appreciate it. With regard, so yeah, I understand why you want to know as much as possible about the book. You really do believe, not just sacramentally, but as a matter of a proposition, that there's something sacred about the origins of the book. Sorry. Well, but my question is, let's go back to the turning water into wine story, right? Mm-hmm. So believing that to be literally true, let's say without much positive evidence that it literally happened, would seem to, it would seem to require a certain, a certain epistemic step, right? If I hear something that sounds physically impossible and that sounds just extremely unlikely, by default, I'm going to disbelieve it. Now, if I hear that, it's associated with this book that I have this very intimate relationship with, and which I think is actually a sacred book, and I do believe in the existence of a sort of sacred realm. It's not like I'm totally atheistic, right? Cool. I still would need something to make me sort of consider seriously whether this happened, sure, without any sort of positive evidence.
Sure. Yeah. So to me, you've just given an argument for why, if you're interested in doing good philosophy, you can't be lazy, right? So yes, I can sit back and say, regarding any issue like this, I can't even imagine what a good argument for that would look like. Sure, that's about the easiest thing for anyone to do. In fact, I think that's most people's default position when it comes to something that they don't already believe. Because if that were not true, they would just believe it, right? So when people don't believe something, that usually means they don't see any evidence for it, and they have a pretty hard time imagining what a good argument for that will look like. And what you have to do, if you care about being intellectually honest and being active-minded, is you have to go seek out the people who claim to believe it and say they argue for it, right? You have to go seek out those experiences. And I'm interested enough to seek them out. Like, I know that there are very intelligent people who believe opposite of me on some of these issues, and they can argue at a very high level, and I'm engaging them, you know? And that's fun for me, that's interesting to me, and it's important to me. You know what I mean?
So I imagine this would take a while to go into too deeply, but I wonder if you can give me just like a bit. What is a kind of argument that somebody would make for saying we should believe this literal event of the turning of the water into wine?
Yeah, so this particular one might be a little tough, but one is you could say, whenever we're debating about literal or metaphorical, you could ask, is there any reason from the context to suppose that the author of this story intended this to be taken in a way other than literal, right? Because sometimes we might say it's metaphorical because we have a prejudice or a bias towards things like that happening in the universe, right? Saying I think that's metaphorical isn't always an indicator that the author clearly intends it to be taken that way. It could be indication of a cultural bias that we have, a materialistic bias, because I don't see that sort of thing happening today. I don't kind of view the world in that sort of magical sounding sense. I have a harder time believing that, and so I'm going to say, well, that's metaphorical. But is there any reason to believe that the author intended it to be that way? There are some contextual arguments that you could make that the moment where Jesus turns water into wine is treated by the author as kind of just like a smaller detail within a larger story that's being told. And that if the author wanted to treat the water into wine thing as this metaphorical extravaganza to make a big point, they probably would have embellished that part of the story a lot more, probably would have gone a lot further with it. There are some ways that they probably could have done that. Mm-hmm. But one could argue that contextually, it sounds like what we're reading here is the description of a wedding event where Jesus does something phenomenal. And it's not told in isolation either, right? You have a reaction to it. You have a story about people being at the wedding and people saying that they drank the wine, and someone expressing surprise that the best wine is for last. I mean, that could be the beginning of an argument. But I think if I were qualified to represent it in its strongest possible light, I wouldn't be in the more agnostic position that I'm in concerning that right now. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. When I first asked you about this, one of the things that you said was that not only do you like the sacramental approach and kind of favor it yourself, but that you think that you think maybe that is the way these books were meant to be were intended to be read.
Yeah, so there are some issues, and I'm working my way through a lot of these because I find the Bible to be the most fascinating book, right? And this is I think any Christian would agree that you ought to be devoting a lifetime to delving into this book and deepening what you understand about it. But there are some areas where I have kind of set my foot down on a strictly metaphorical interpretation, in the same way that I say about the physical, right? Like in the same way that I say, no, I actually have an intellectual belief in God and Jesus and all these sorts of things. There are certain areas where I say, look, no, I believe that's a real historical event. I believe that person really lived. They really said that event really happened. And I share the same thing when it comes to the metaphorical interpretation. So one area, and this should be an interesting one, because I think it's probably one of the more controversial ones, and I actually think it's more hardcore, which conflicts with our intuition about why a person would want to go the metaphorical route, because we usually soften things up with the metaphorical interpretation. But let's take Jesus talking about like the New Testament writings on hell. Okay, the Christian idea of hell. We have imagery of things like a bottomless pit. We have a lake of fire. We have much weeping and gnashing of teeth, and all these sorts of things, right? And the Christian traditional imagery of hell is, like burning forever. Like you're in a vast lake of fire and you're burning forever, and that is truly a horrific image. And there's the corresponding imagery for heaven, where we have things like streets of gold, for instance. Okay. Now, here's my take on why I think that's metaphorical. And then I'll give my take on why I think that's more hardcore. So here you have New Testament writers trying to convey the idea of intimacy and oneness with God as the ultimate state of being, right? And then you have the notion of separation from God or alienation from God as being the ultimate state of being in the opposite direction. Nothing is worse than separation from God. I don't care how much money you got, how much success you got. Nothing is worse than being separated from God, and nothing is greater than being one with God. And most Christians would say that, hey, streets of gold and pearly gates aside, that stuff is the embellishment, right? Nothing is greater than oneness with God, intimacy with God, being in the presence of God. Nothing is worse than being eternally separated from God. Now, that's a pretty abstract concept, though. If you're trying to convey that to a human being, you're trying to convey the bliss and the pleasure and the awesomeness of oneness with God. That's pretty hard to do. Now, a person that's older and has memorized all the right answers on the theology exam will pretend to get it. But if you want to conduct an experiment, just go talk to a child, and ask them, what would you like more, chocolate ice cream or oneness with God? And some of them will get it right, but most of them will break your hearts, right? Because most of them won't be prepared for such a test. And so you're trying to convey these things to a finite mind. You're trying to convey the idea of infinite pleasure and infinite pain to a finite mind. I think it's utterly brilliant that you would take something that people value, that people really love, like gold, right? You've got gold, you've got pearls, you've got all these different types of jewels. People get that. And you can say, all right, imagine this gold, right? This thing that you guys are willing to kill each other for, you guys are willing to become slaves for. In fact, we spent all this time in the Bible warning you not to make gold your first priority. So you guys clearly love this. Imagine a place where gold, the thing that you think is the most important, is like just the pavement, the street pavement, right? Like gold is like dirt. It's like the road that you walk on. So what you think is the ceiling is the frickin' street pavement. That's what heaven is like. Okay. Now, for hell, imagine, fire as a destructive force. You know that it makes you uncomfortable. You know that if you touch it, it'll burn you. You know that it's consuming, that it's destructive, and it cannot be controlled. And you even have a tradition of, the 3 Hebrew boys being thrown into the fiery furnace, and the fire being so hot that the men who threw them in, fainted because of that. What more horrific image can we convey than imagine a fire that never perishes and you're in it? That's frightening, right? That's horrifying. But I would contend that first, those kind of images are necessary because you're trying to convey the idea of infinite pain to a finite mind, infinite horror to a finite mind, and infinite joy, infinite pleasure to a finite mind. Okay? But to say that the joy of being in the presence of God for an eternity is adequately captured by streets of gold and pearly gates, it's kind of an undersell for an infinite being, right? God has got to be, by definition, God has got to be like billions of times more enjoyable than that, right? And if hell is really eternal separation from God, it's got to be worse than that. And I would say that the metaphor is only an approximation of the reality, right? The metaphor is a way of trying to take a concept that is too big for a finite mind to understand, and you represent it in terms of something that they can understand. But like George Lakoff says in Metaphors We Live By, metaphors serve two functions. They simultaneously reveal and they simultaneously conceal. Because in order to highlight something using a metaphor, you also have to hide something else. You've got to de-emphasize something else. And so I would say that if you adopt a metaphorical interpretation of lake of fire, the first time I think I ever expressed that, I had someone be like, "Oh no, you're just trying to make it soft. You're just trying to make it weak." And I say, actually, I'm making it worse, because if I'm saying that the description of hell as a lake of fire is only a metaphor, then that means I'm committing myself to the belief that whatever hell is, it's way worse than that. It's way worse than you could possibly imagine. And whatever heaven is, it's way better than that. It's some kind of state of being that we cannot even conceive. And the Bible literally says this, right? No eye hath seen, no mind hath conceived. It's something that can't even be conceived. And so we have to use metaphors of like spatial locations with physical properties. I don't consider myself agnostic about. I'm still open to arguments towards it. But that would be an example of something that, hey, I actually accept that as a metaphorical interpretation. And I would say that is kind of a response to a sacramental experience of, engaging those kinds of texts.
So it sounds like with regard to belief, right? You do believe in the possibility of and reality of some miracles.
Yeah.
There's a fairly.
I believe that both miracles can happen, and I believe that things that we call miracles have occurred in history. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a pretty widespread assumption in sort of intellectual discourse that those things aren't real, right? And that they don't, and that there's a certain burden of proof that they don't meet. From that kind of intellectual perspective, what do you say to that? Why do you think that's there? What is your response to it?
Yeah. So first, we kind of have to think outside the box a little bit when it comes to miracles. I don't believe that a miracle is ever experienced by the miracle worker as a miracle, right? A miracle is the name given to something by an outside observer of the mystery when it takes place, right? But from the miracle worker's point of view, it's simply working knowingly with power, working knowingly with the rules of reality, right? So it's not like if Jesus turns water into wine, his mind is being blown. It's not like if Jesus is turning water into wine, he's like, what? Oh my gosh, how did I do that? How did that happen? It's so amazing, right? It's he knows how to do it, right? That if he turns water into wine, it's because he is the creator of the atoms and the molecules and all that. No, it doesn't mean that he's thinking to himself, what's the formula again? But he is the creator of all of that. He knows how it works.
Right. So there are sort of rules to how reality works, and a miracle worker has mastery of them in such a way that they can cause this to happen, and it's not like a random special thing. It's actual mastery of the works, the rules of reality.
Yeah, that what we call a miracle is the manifestation of higher intelligence, right? A higher understanding, a superior understanding of the rules of reality. And there are plenty of scriptures about this where God says things like, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts, right? Or God says, Lord, I don't know if I will be able to speak. And God says, I formed the mouth, right? Like, You're worried about running out of words, and you're talking to the person that created your body. I probably can get you some words, right? I probably can get some thoughts to you. I'm operating in a higher realm here, right? I know you don't understand it, but my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. My abilities are superior to your abilities, right? Or, Moses and the children of Israel in the desert. We're running out of water. We're going to die, and God's coming at this from the point of view, like, I literally parted a Red Sea for you to get across. I probably can figure out how to get some water to you in the desert. There might be something that you don't know about water, right? There might be something that you don't know about how water is made and where it comes from that I know, since I literally created everything, right? If we have evidence for anything, it is that we don't know the half about the rules of reality, right? We're still trying to figure that out. So Dallas Willard makes an interesting observation about this. He talks about how we do Jesus a disservice when we talk about him only as someone that is powerful and virtuous, right? We put all the emphasis on Jesus' character. He's virtuous, on his power, that he can make the wind and the waves obey him. Like, shut up, storm, and it will listen to them. We capture that very well. But there's also something that is true about Jesus that we don't say very much. We're not very comfortable saying it. But if he really is who Christians say he is, it has to be true. And that is, get ready for it, Jesus is smart. Now, that almost feels uncomfortable, right? That almost feels like, wait a minute, I don't know if I like that. But there is no way you can claim to be an intellectually honest Christian and say Jesus is not smart. You might want to say, yeah, he's more than that. That's fine. But that's why we started with those things, so that you wouldn't get defensive about it. But Dallas Willard says he is the smartest to have ever lived. No, I didn't say wise. I mean, Jesus has a superior understanding of physics than Albert Einstein. Jesus has a superior understanding of mathematics than Stephen Hawking. Jesus has a superior understanding of basketball than Michael Jordan. That just sounds so wrong, right? Jesus has a superior understanding of art than Picasso. That just sounds so wrong because we're not accustomed that way. But the multidimensional, infinite nature of Jesus, when we deny those properties to him. And so when Jesus is turning water into wine, you're not just dealing with a virtuous person or a powerful person, but you're dealing with an exceptionally smart person and who would know how to do this. So I guess the final answer to how I would reconcile these things is that I would say I reject the typical philosophical characterization of miracles as violations of laws of nature, and I would reframe it as the transcending of our known understanding of the laws of nature.
Yeah. So that makes sense. My question, let me push back on this. There's a question of burden of proof here.
Yeah.
So I agree that there's tons, more than we could possibly imagine, that we just don't know. That there is more physically possible in the world than we could have any idea about.
And it's already conceded as a readily accepted maxim in the secular world that a sufficiently advanced technology would appear to be magic.
Right.
Right? That's already accepted.
Yeah.
And that what bridges the gap is nothing more than understanding the workings of the law that produced what appears to be magic.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's true. And I think that, for anything that's discussed in the Bible or sort of miracles that I talked about, imagining that with enough knowledge, with enough technological prowess, let's say, those things are possible does not really seem unlikely. It doesn't seem like a stretch. But to believe that any one sort of, seemingly unlikely thing happened, any specific seemingly unlikely thing happened,
Sure.
you still need more more pushing you in that direction than the mere possibility.
Yeah, so okay, I agree, but I also don't think I don't think that's a uniquely difficult question for religion, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't wrestle with it. But I'll give an example. Do you believe that racism exists? And what I don't mean do you believe institutional racism exists? I don't mean do you believe that it's a major problem in America? I'm asking something super modest here. Do you believe there exist people in the world today who harbor racist attitudes and have probably at some point or other expressed them to another person or caused harm to another person because of it?
Yes.
Okay. That seems pretty easy and safe to answer, right? Okay. Now here's a second question. Can you prove any particular instance where you think race has been an issue, that it wasn't that issue? I would say that's hard as hell, right? Like,
absolutely. But
I can show you video footage of like a person of one race beating a person of another race and doing harm to them. And there will still be plenty of room to be like, okay, I don't know what happened before we turned that video on. I don't know what that was about, right? There's plenty of room for skepticism. So acknowledging a general truth that I think such a thing exists and such a thing happens doesn't make it easy. Particular claims where we say, here's an instance of it.
Yeah, but so one thing is having sufficient proof that you can be certain of something, which is a criterion that I actually don't think anything meets. But there's a different thing, which is there sufficient evidence that I should give, enough credence that it counts as belief, not certain belief, but belief, right? So with the idea that there are racist people in the world, I cannot be sure of it, not by any means, but I've seen enough evidence of a wide enough variety that I give it a pretty high level of credence.
Sure, but I still want to point out that is still the mere expression of a personal belief, and that if you try to go out into the outer world, I can easily introduce you to a ton of people that you would never convince that any particular instance was really about race.
Mm.
I can easily find you people that would not give that up, and they'd be sincere. They'd be like, that doesn't mean that it was about race. Maybe he was just being a jerk. Maybe he was just being an asshole. How do you know it was about race?
I feel like this is not a great example because because I think there have to be documented examples of people saying this is about race. You'd have to you'd have to say that they were lying when they said that.
Well, take a look at the whole Black Lives Matter debate. I don't want to drag you into an unwanted discussion on race, and I'm not pushing you down believing a particular thing, right? I'm working within the context of your assumptions that you believe that racism exists. Take a look at nearly any scenario where in mainstream media people do say race is an issue and how impossible it is to get any agreement based on the difficulty of proving it. So you want to go with the Starbucks issue? There are people saying that those two black guys were arrested because it's about race. You don't have to agree with that. But there's a particular instance where lots of people are saying it's about race. And half the country's like, no, it wasn't. It wasn't about race. It was about those guys not listening to the rules, this and that. And then the other side comes back with arguments. But there was a white woman who said she did the same thing the other day and it didn't happen to her. And they're never going to agree with each other. And that would be as close as you can get, right? Like somebody had it on video, like it was a white person who recorded it. There were white witnesses saying that this was about race, and you still can't prove it because you're trying to prove something that by its very nature is very open to skeptical challenges. I'm not using this to dismiss your question because I want to get to it and I want to give my 2 cents on it. But I want to make sure we frame the issue with an understanding of the inherent complexity, not just some kind of special complexity that belongs to religion.
Well, I don't think the analogy works.
Okay.
And I think the reason that the analogy doesn't work is that the question I'm asking is fundamentally about evidence and the role of evidence, right? So if there's a good amount of evidence, first of all, let's assume that we agree that anything is possible, or that anything that let's say anything that isn't logically incoherent is possible.
Sure.
And so it's not so there's no question about whether miracles or anything like that are possible. But the question is about what do we give credence to, right? To sort of bring up the Bertrand Russell objection, right? It's possible that there's a teapot in the sky, but if we have no reason to believe it, then we don't give that any credence, though it certainly is possible.
Oh.
So now when we start looking at the question of what we give credence to, we have to look at evidence, right? So if there's evidence, then we can evaluate that evidence. And certainly people debate the significance of evidence, and people who have like a particularly strong affinity for some view will do what they can to twist the evidence so that they can keep that view, right?
Sure.
But still, if you're being intellectually honest, then your credence is going to be a function of the evidence that you see, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there's more involved, but at least the evidence should make a difference to the level of your credence. So now, when it comes to miracles, right? What is the role of evidence there for you? Granted that we believe sort of metaphysically they're possible. What is the role of evidence in believing them?
Yeah. So I agree that we've reached an impasse with whether or not I used a good example with race. I probably should have been more transparent and just freely admitted that the reason I thought it was a good example is because I have had experiences like that that I did feel were racialized, and I realized very quickly how difficult it is to convince people that those experiences are real. I find that it's pretty predictable for me. If I were to ever claim a racialized experience, I can predict, usually with startling accuracy, who will believe me and who will demand tons of evidence and will never accept it as true. Okay, so that's kind of why it resonated with me. But let's toss that out because I don't want to create a distraction here. But there's even something more fundamental than that I was trying to even illustrate through the race example, and that is the distinction between knowing and showing. Right? Knowing that something is true means that you possess some reason for accepting it as a fact, that you are aware of something at some level or other. Showing something is true means that you possess the combination of skills and resources to be able to demonstrate the truth of what you know to another. And those two things don't always come together. Sometimes they come apart, right? Sometimes we can know that certain things are true, but when we try to show others that they are true, we encounter some difficulties that aren't present in the mere knowing of it. So one rudimentary example would be if I have a headache right now. No need for me to experience any doubt about this. Well, TK, maybe you merely think you have a headache, but you don't actually have one. No, my brother, to think that I have a headache is to actually have one. That is the definition, man. If I think I have pain in my head, I have a headache. Sorry, you can't make me skeptical of what I directly experience. On the other hand, I can totally see how you can be skeptical. Here I am clutching my bottle of Tylenol and I'm shaking and, I'm sweating and I'm telling you that it's pain. But, if you don't know me very well, you could be like, oh, I think it's an act. You're doing it for attention. You're trying to be dramatic and all of that. And it's quite possible that I may lose in my effort to convince you that I really do have a headache. But that doesn't mean I don't have a legitimate claim to knowledge. It just means I don't have any rational basis for condemning you for being a skeptic, right? Now, when it comes to miracles, this is a very important distinction because one of the things we talked about is that based on my understanding of what miracles are, if a miracle occurs, it's not a random event. Okay? It might appear to be random because we don't know what the cause of it is or we don't see the pattern. But if there is a miracle, it is an event with intentionality behind it, that some higher intelligence is intervening, right, and doing something that we don't understand. So let's come back to the Christian tradition from which, I speak, and take a look at miracles in the Bible. Contrary to Hollywood presentations of miracles, they're not just randomly occurring supernatural events. Every miracle in the Bible has a specific context and a specific purpose, right? So the miracle of the parting of the Red Seas was not just something where God one day was like, I'm bored, Red Sea part, right? There was some higher purpose going on. There was one man leading another group of people to, from slavery. They were being pursued. They encountered an obstacle. God told him, this is your purpose. This is where I want you to go. They encounter something. The enemy is coming, and God demonstrates his power in that moment and parts the Red Sea. All right. So wherever we have a miracle in the Christian tradition, there is some kind of purpose for the miracle, and it is an act of intervention of higher intelligence. So that tells you something very important about miracles that's very different from other kinds of events. It tells you that two things. Number one, that it did not happen because of you. It might have happened because of what you were going through or whatever, but it happened because a higher intelligence knew how to do something that you don't know how to do. Okay? So that means if some skeptic comes along and says, do it again, you're dependent on the higher intelligence that made it possible in the first place. Secondly, it did not happen as a random event. It happened because the being that knew how to make it happen had a specific purpose in that context for making it happen. So once again, if some skeptic comes along and says, I refuse to believe unless you can replicate the event, well, you kind of got to get the being that made it happen to care about that, right? So we have a number of problems that come up when we try to take miracles that we experience, right? Because no one can say, hey, be at my house tonight. Be in my house at 7 o'clock tonight, because it's some miracles that's going to go down, right? Miracles by their very nature are the kinds of things that will catch you by surprise, right? There's a higher likelihood for miracles that when they catch you, you won't be optimally prepared, right, to document it for the world to see. And they're going to be by their very nature unrepeatable, not because they can't happen, but because you don't know how the heck they happen. So when someone claims to have experienced a miracle, by the very nature of what a miracle is, we should expect this to be something from the outset that they have an extremely difficult time proving. What does that mean? What does it not mean? What it does mean is that, what it does not mean is that the person we're talking to has zero reason to believe. What it does mean is that it certainly would be irrational and unfair to demand that you take an act of faith based on somebody else's story that you yourself can't verify. And perhaps that's where I might differ from some religious people, in that I don't think it's reasonable or fair to treat someone else's skepticism, as if it can't be sincere, or as if it should just be overridden by what I say I experience. But, to give an example of what we're talking about, man, I mean, I know I'm taking something that, no one believes happens, but, let's take like a paranormal experience, like seeing a ghost, or let's just go with the Bible story, or like angel visitation.
Actually, hold on, because I think there's a set, you've answered some of what I've been wanting to ask about, but there's part of it that I think you're still evaded.
Part of it that I
think you still haven't quite answered.
That I might have failed to address, but that I'm more than happy to address.
Sorry, I didn't. Sorry for saying evaded. That was a loaded word.
Because if I wanted to evade, I'd shut the camera down. I'd be like, oh, my phone's ringing. But I'm here. If there's anything I'm extremely comfortable doing, it's addressing your question. So corner me, come at me, put it out there if I'm not answering it. Don't let me get away. I'm saying this on camera. Don't let me get away without thoroughly satisfying you with my answering your questions. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you've talked about justifying your own belief in a miracle to someone else. And for that, your analogy about the headache was very good. But I'm really talking about what your evidence is in the first place. right? So even when in the case of the headache, somebody else is maybe justified in not believing you, but the reason you believe you have a headache is because you actually feel it, right?
So that's what I'm saying. That's where I'm going. I'm saying that wherever there is a miracle, the very nature of the miracle demands that the evidence would be direct experience.
Okay.
That like the angel Gabriel or a being showed up and said, "I'm Gabriel. I'm here with a message from God." What is the nature of that evidence? Hey, William, I had this experience. I know you're going to think I'm crazy, okay? But here's something that happened to me that from everything that I know strikes me as out of this world, okay? Here's something that happened to me, and I'm calling this a miracle. That anytime anybody says they believe in a miracle, that's what's going on. It may not be an angelic visitation, but that's what's going on.
Yeah. So are there any particular miracles, that you any specific miracles that you believe in, that you believe happened?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, and all of them are of the sort that I don't know if I could prove. I don't know if I could argue them for someone else because they're of a deeply personal nature. But I would say, I've had experiences that I would describe as miraculous in nature that goes beyond the sacramental stuff that I talked about earlier, that goes beyond merely engaging the scriptures in a prayerful way and being transformed as a result of that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I would say that for those,
but I would put those in the same category as like me running into a racist guy at 2:00 in the morning who punches me in my face and calls me the N-word. Like, okay, that's a real experience for me, but I'm completely hopeless that I could convince anyone that would be true other than my absolute best friends who would accept that for no other reason than that they just give me free reign to tell my story and they wouldn't believe I would make it up. It's in the same category. I would never bring it up in any kind of debate about religion for the existence of God because I think it's evidentially meaningless, although it's personally meaningful.
Yeah. But my I ask you that not because, of course, for anybody else, it's still possible to doubt, right? But I'm inquiring about your relationship to epistemic justification. Now, if you personally had an experience that really seemed like a miracle, I think that goes a long way to explaining your belief in the existence of real miracles, whether or not you could justify that to anybody else. Now. Yeah. Are there? Now I take it there are also historical miracles that specific ones.
Yeah, can I qualify this though?
Yeah,
because there's an aspect to this that's similar to what you said about your psychedelic experience too, right? On one end, you have this experience, right? But then you hold yourself to a really high standard for what propositions you will say on the basis of it, right? So I've had some experiences. I'd be curious to know if you did as well. I've had some experiences about which I can say are extremely difficult for me to account for or explain in terms of anything I know, right? And they're deeply personal experiences. One might call them paranormal. One might call them just crazy, weird, whatever they might be. And those experiences provide an impression that there are things that are going on in the world that I don't fully understand. And it's kind of like in the movie Interstellar, right? Where later on in the movie,
I hope this isn't crucial because I haven't seen it.
Oh, I'm gonna stop right there. Oh shoot. We were close.
Were you about to spoil it?
We were close. Yeah, I'm so sorry. So yeah. Woo. Oh my gosh. Please watch that so we can talk about it, by the way. Please watch it, by the way. But anyway, let me back away from that point and not even say anything remotely similar to it so you can't Uh, but like how I imagine with your psychedelic experiences, that these experiences change you. They leave an indelible mark on you, but they also make you more curious about the world that you live in. They drive you deeper into philosophical inquiry, and they create a stronger confidence in your knowledge that there's a lot out there that you don't know. And I hesitate to attribute a whole lot of detail to what I think is going on. That's still something that I don't quite understand, that I philosophize about, speculate about, and so forth. But yeah,
I would say I've had an experience. I can only think of one at the moment that I would characterize more or less exactly that way.
Yeah.
I can't explain it, and it seems like to take it as a simple sort of coincidence, let's say, is possible, but it really sort of boggles the mind. Not only what occurred, which you could sort of say, well, coincidences, crazy coincidences happen once in a while, right? But this occurred during a psychedelic experience, the day that I fell in love with the woman that I would eventually marry and that I'm still with. And, I have to, again, just being intellectually honest, right? I'm very skeptical, and I'm skeptical sometimes of people's sort of motives and needs to maybe sort of romanticize the world. But at the same time, if I'm being intellectually honest, I know what happened. I was there, and I know that it's very, very difficult to account for. But also, I don't give that any. Again, there's very little that I would say, well, therefore, I think that such and such is possible, or that the world works in such and such a way. It's more just there's clearly some shit that I don't understand going on,
or whatever. Yeah, but it certainly does have a sense of opening you up to a broader sense of possibility. Man, I damn sure don't know everything. I don't know what that's all about. I can't just dismiss that. And it does provide some reason for believing that even if this transcendence, according to a higher understanding, is materialistically explained, at a phenomenological level, it is transcendent relative to your known reality. And to me, that's an important thing. That's an important recognition.
Yeah. So here's where I guess the last question I wanted to ask on this whole topic of believing in miracles. The fact that happened to me certainly opens up my mind to the possibility of more going on than I can understand.
Sure.
At the same time, if any given person tells me about something that sounds somewhat miraculous, right?
Right.
My default status is going to be to not believe. Not because I think that necessarily they're lying, and I wouldn't necessarily be super confident about disbelieving. I highly believe that this did not happen. It's just that, again, even if I believe that anything is possible, to believe any one thing, especially if it's a sort of thing that seems out of the ordinary, right? I feel like I need a relatively strong amount of evidence.
So first, I would say, I agree with that, right? I don't look at that as a particularly controversial claim, but I think there may be more nuance to that than what you're estimating. So I'm not sure if it's entirely true that it would just be a default in any scenario. I think there are scenarios where personal experiences you've had in the area might lend a greater degree of plausibility to certain kinds of experiences, particularly if they describe them as being similar to the kinds that you've had. I believe there's probably a range of plausibility for you where people can say, well, I had this experience, and you're like, that just sounds crazy. And, people say, well, I had this experience, and you're like, wow, that sounds a lot like mine, right? So even though we both may have a default skepticism in the sense of saying, look, I'm not just going to accept on faith without the consideration of any kind of evidence, without asking any questions if this happened. I also can't sit here and pretend that my reaction would be identical if my wife told me about a certain kind of experience and some complete stranger did. I mean, there is a greater burden upon me if someone like my wife were to tell me about an experience, or my brother would tell me about an experience. It doesn't mean that I automatically believe, but it means I now have another set of questions I have to deal with, because it's not as easy for me to just say, well, they're making it up for attention, or it's not as easy for me to dismiss it because I've got a lot more data to work with. And whatever position I take on this, I'm going to have to explain away some difficult things. So even if I say, I don't think that really happened, I've got some difficult things I got to explain away. So it's going to be a lot more work. You know, there's an inconvenience to my skepticism that will be present with certain kinds of stories and certain people telling me.
Yeah. Well, credibility comes into the picture, right? The credibility of the person that you're speaking to seems like it is important at this point, or the person telling you about it.
But it's not just that either. It's not just credibility. It's also like our concept of plausibility is also based on what we've experienced. See, this is why I hate that you don't like my race example, because I think it just expresses all of this so well. Like, people's tendency to accept as true individual stories about racist experiences tend to be neatly correlated with their own. You know, if people don't have an experience of being treated that way, it can be hard for them to imagine it, and they attribute a lower degree of initial plausibility. Like, if I were to go up to like any black man in the inner city and just be like, hey man, you know, this cop just harassed me because I was black, I probably would get no skepticism. Every guy would probably be like, yep, I know exactly what you're talking about. Even if I made that story up, right? Because that group of people would attribute high initial plausibility to it. It just sounds believable to them. But why is that? It's not because they don't care about evidence. It's because it's consistent with the way they experience the world. Well, why is it that if I tell you, hey man, I just went to the grocery store and I saw that Frosted Flakes was on sale for like 2 boxes for $2. You wouldn't demand any evidence. You just accept my word for it. Not just because I'm trustworthy. You would accept it if a total stranger told you that, because it just strikes you as plausible. You've seen those sorts of things happen in the world that you live in. So it's not just about credibility. It's what's plausible to us, and that ranges subjectively with what we've experienced. If you've had what you believe to be an out of body experience, you are going to be more sympathetic when people make claims about out of body experiences, while you might still mock people who claim to have experienced UFOs or ghosts. Right.
Yeah, I think the reason I didn't like your race example is because compared to miracles, the idea that you could categorically doubt that sort of thing. I have so much initial plausibility, as you're saying, to the idea that racism could be a factor that it seems ridiculous to me to doubt it so categorically, as opposed to miracles where it seems very natural to me to doubt them unless there's like very strong evidence. You know?
Yeah, I guess one of the things I liked about it is that at the level of individual experience, the overwhelming majority of people have claimed to have at least like one experience in their lifetime that would be described as like paranormal. Now, we can make fun of them or dismiss them, but I would say the divide is pretty comparable. That there are people who say, no, these things don't happen. I don't believe them. I don't experience the world that way. And when people say that, I kind of think they're making it up. They're looking for attention. They're projecting. They naturally have a victimized view of the world, or they're making excuses, or they have a bunch of psychological stuff going on, and they're reading into it a little bit. You know, I think it's I thought it was a pretty good analogy, just because there are a lot of people, I don't want to defend that analogy anymore, but lots of people claim to have, at an individual level, have had paranormal experiences. And lots of people may not talk about it in the open, but everything from near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, having seen ghosts, all sorts of things. But, you know, people are often afraid they'll be looked at as crazy, but lots of people have had those types of experiences.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I admit I'm even a little apprehensive about sharing my mentioning the experience that I had, but
Well,
being
for me,
honest.
it's deeply personal. I mean, I haven't gone into anything, and I think that's fair. I'd have to think about it, to think about how much detail I would want to share about personal experiences that I would call miraculous.
I don't even mean going into the details. I just mean like just sort of acknowledging that there have been sort of things of this nature.
Absolutely.
Definitely takes something. Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to say that this conversation has made like after in a way I feel like we've made a lot of progress, because as you've sort of answered my questions about justification and evidence, it does seem a lot more reasonable to me, your position, right? To believe in certain miracles. Yeah, I kind of wanted to ask you about your belief in some miracles. That's sort of why I was asking about credibility, is because I still wanted to ask, like, why do you? It sounded like you believe in some of the sort of miraculous things in the Bible, and I sort of wanted to ask why. But if you have enough experience to believe that miracles are not only possible but do happen, and the Bible has a certain place for you as this sort of sacred book, then it seems a lot more reasonable to sort of lend the Bible the kind of credibility where you would at least consider that some of those miracles might be true, in a way that you might be much more skeptical if it was just like a guy on the street, let's say. That's kind of how I'm reading, how I'm sort of like taking in your position. I don't know if you want to say anything about it.
Yeah, and there's an entire religious context, right? I mean, you have the context of the religious community of which you are a part, the context of the religious tradition, a tradition that has other stories, a tradition that has other members who have experiences and so forth. And there is a reinforcing element to that. So for instance, maybe with you, for instance, you spend a lot of time around people that are entrepreneurial, right? And so there are certain things you come to believe, certain ways that you come to think by living this entrepreneurial life. But then you're also part of this community where other people are living the life. They're working out their issues. They're sharing their stories. You're watching the impact that these stories are having on their lives. Sometimes you're experiencing things alongside them. And what can happen over time is that certain types of stories acquire, through those experiences, a greater degree of believability, more resistance to your natural skepticism, because they're not happening in isolation. They're not a bunch of isolated stories from people that you don't know, that you can't scrutinize, that you can't talk to, whose character that you can't evaluate, saying, hey, I was abducted by a UFO. Like, okay, I watched a documentary on that, and some guy, I never get to talk to him, right? That's different from knowing somebody for 15 years, being alongside them in a community, witnessing their character, seeing what kind of person they are, seeing them like have the opportunity to lie for attention, to lie for personal gain, and they don't do it, and they don't do it. And then all of a sudden, in a way that's completely inconsistent with all of your natural skeptical theories for dismissing their story, they claim something happens, and they react to what they claim has happened in a way that seems to be best explained by this actually happened to them. You respond to those things differently. It doesn't mean that they give you some sort of easy argument for theism, but it certainly changes the context for sure.
Yeah. I want to ask you one more question. Given the whole picture that you've given of Christianity, you've compared it to other kind of sacramental practices, and one thing that makes me want to ask is why this one then, right? And there's an impulse that people have whether it's in spirituality or knowledge seeking or whatever, to find a kind of, universal kinds of methods, right? And you're sort of giving yourself to something that you kind of acknowledge is one of many sort of kinds of things that could play this sort of role. So the question would be, why this one?
Yeah. So for me, to be a Christian means that it is within the context of the Christian tradition, its practices, its disciplines, its narrative, that the reality of the sacred is most effectively mediated to me. And that, this is where the action is for me. This is where the energy is for me. This is where the experience is for me. If I had to appeal to your psychedelic experience, maybe I'm just going to make it up to fill in the gaps, but maybe it was LSD for you, right? And maybe you tried ayahuasca and it didn't do anything for you, right? And LSD is where it's at. That's the thing that works for you. That's the thing that has the sacramental function. That's where it's at. So for me, it is not a way of saying that I have not tried other paths, that I have not explored other faiths, but it's a way of saying this is home. This is my energetic home. And yeah. I mean, that's pretty much it, man. It's that context for me.
Do you think that there is anything that somebody else who would be practicing a kind of sacramental practice the way that you practice Christianity would be missing out on because they are doing theirs and not Christianity? And I don't mean missing out on something that's like, maybe they're missing out on something that's very particular to Christianity, but maybe isn't super fundamental and they have their own things like that, but something sort of serious that they would be missing.
Yeah, so I actually am a religious pluralist. Okay, I'm not a Christian exclusivist, and for me, I have studied other faiths. I find great meaning and great practices in other traditions and so forth. Even though I have my native tradition, my home tradition, I would say that one of the implications of the sacramental approach is that you're not approaching religion through a justificatory lens. And this question kind of comes from that vantage point. It's a question that aims at getting at, well, is your status or standing before God justified if you are not part of this tradition? And it's really another way of sneaking in that belief requirement, right? We're measuring the value of our religious practice by whether or not we have achieved or obtained the proper justificatory status, rather than focusing on making ourselves available to the divine in whatever way we know, in whatever way we can. So I guess you could say this is similar to my answer to the traditional question in Christian apologetics. Well, what happens to the person that, grows up on an island and they never hear about Jesus? Because according to the traditional view, you gotta accept Jesus. And my understanding of that is that the divine does not hold us responsible for the availability of evidence or the manner in which knowledge is revealed. But he does hold us accountable for the pursuit of truth. And that it's not my responsibility to make the truth more obvious or to deal with the fact that the truth may not be as obvious as I would hope it to be, but rather to pursue the truth and practice the truth and be faithful to the truth in whatever way I can. Then I believe that's all of our responsibility. We all know different things. We've all been exposed to different things. And what the sacramental approach to religion offers us is an opportunity to not be held back by what we know and what we don't know, an opportunity to boldly approach the throne of grace, that we might obtain help in time of need, even if we don't know enough, even if we haven't been taught the right things. That the God of the cosmos is a God that is neither threatened by our uncertainty or our erroneous beliefs or our ignorance. And as long as we are sincere, we will not be rejected by the divine on account of not being sufficiently educated to pass a theology exam. But it is a God who, according to the psalmist, will not despise a broken spirit and a contrite heart. And I believe that that is the essence of the sacramental approach, you know. So go where you are guided and worship and pray and practice faith with sincerity. And make yourself available to the transformative experiences of the sacred wherever you are, wherever you can. For me, it's not about passing a theology exam. It's about, opening to grace, you know?
Hey, man. Thank you so much. I'm gonna call it there, unless there's something else you have burning.
One way I like to put what I just said is, this is a statement that I used to make all the time. I used to say, Jesus may be the only way to God, but Christianity isn't the only way to Jesus. That who Jesus is so much bigger than any of the theories of atonement we can form about him or intellectually subscribe to. And the divine reality that is made manifest in Jesus is made available throughout the world, even by those who don't even know they're engaging with it, even by those who think they reject it, far beyond the boundaries of institutional Christianity or things that are associated with the Christian religion. That's all.
Well, thanks, man. I just want to say that I've had a problem for a long time with a sort of kind of assumption that I hear that there's something necessarily kind of anti-intellectual about being religious or being Christian. I'm not sort of traditionally religious myself, but I've had a kind of appreciation for some of, in a weird way, I want to say, for some of the aesthetic of Christianity. And and I just want to thank you for for answering all my questions and for sort of providing this picture of Christianity that is obviously very much compatible with an intellectual life. So thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, man. So a couple of things. Number one, have I left anything in the realm of evasion? I don't want you to let me get away without holding me accountable to something that you wanted to know or that you felt you asked that wasn't answered.
I don't think there was anything that I asked that I'm unsatisfied with your answers. There's probably a million more things I could ask, but okay. I'm satisfied with everything that we've discussed so far.
Yeah. The second thing is, I think it would be interesting to have a conversation about the experiential and existential aspects of faith. Where this was more about, hey, what's your background? Where do you stand epistemically on like the question of miracles, or maybe the truth of the Bible, or do you give a literal or metaphorical rendering to that? But I think there's a lot of wisdom in the scriptures and the Bible stories and the Christian tradition that provide insights for living. I think it'd be fun to talk about that. We also talked about Christianity and anarchy, where I tend to my impression from the Bible has always been that of a sort of anarchist spirit. I love to have some conversation about that. And then my last thing is, this is, I heard Jordan Peterson being questioned about where he stands on the physical resurrection of Jesus. And I know that just by mentioning his name, I've already triggered millions of people, right? Assuming you got millions of podcast listeners. But I heard him say something to the effect of, check back with me on that in a few years because I'm wrestling with it. And that's something that I relate to. All the responses I've read to that have kind of mocked that or downplayed that. But that's something that I find admirable, and that's something that a process that I honor in my belief formation as well, which is let's have this again, because I'm working a lot of this out, and it's a fun and fulfilling process, but it's one that I take very seriously. And for anybody who's listening, I encourage you to investigate the issues yourself, and don't stop thinking about it. Don't stop wrestling with it, and don't look for the stopping point to your thinking. Look for your answers, but look for answers to be things that guide you into deeper experience and better questions, rather than your answers being the things to put you out of the misery that is your experience of uncertainty or doubt.
Hey, yeah, and by the way, I had in mind to do like a whole section of this conversation about the Bible and anarchism, but somewhere along the line I realized if I try to do that, I'm gonna have to cut this part short, and I'd rather just go in as deep as we want to here, and then I'll invite you for another one to talk about specifically that topic.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to it, man. I appreciate it.
All right, man. Thanks a lot. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, I will explore the liar paradox with Professor Stephen Reed. Specifically, we will cover the history of the paradox and its solutions before diving deep into a particular medieval solution that Professor Reed has rediscovered and popularized. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.